Yet, it was this comment that led them down a rabbit hole they never could have anticipated. The name he dropped, an innocuous name at first, kept coming up in their investigation. A name that seemed tied to the case in ways they couldn't immediately understand. Was this new lead real, or was it just another false trail? They couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, the killer continued to execute his plans with unnerving precision, seemingly unaffected by the tightening noose around him. He knew they were looking for him, and in his mind, he had already outsmarted them. His arrogance only grew with each passing day. What the detectives didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know yet, was that this killer had a secret so deeply buried that it could never be uncovered by traditional investigative methods. He had connections, people who owed him favors, people who would lie for him, cover for him, and keep his name out of the public eye. These people were silent shadows, never revealing themselves, always staying in the background, never leaving a trace. As the detectives dug deeper into his life, the connections between the victims began to show faint signs of something bigger, but still, they couldn't put the pieces together. Each victim seemed unconnected to the others, yet somehow, there was an undercurrent, a thread weaving them together. Was it personal? Was there a hidden motive that none of the victims had shared? And more importantly, why hadn't the killer left any significant evidence behind? There was something about this case that just didn't feel right. Then, just as the case seemed to stall, a new lead emerged. A string of calls. It started with a woman, her voice shaky, almost pleading. She had heard something the night of the last murder, something that didn't make sense to her at the time. She hadn't called the police immediately, thinking it was just a coincidence. But now, as the investigation grew colder, she realized it wasn't a coincidence at all. She claimed to have seen someone in the vicinity of the crime scene on that night, but when she looked closer, she swore it was the same man who had been at the bar, a man she knew by name. His name, strangely enough, was connected to the earlier tip from the dismissed witness. Could this be the break the detectives had been waiting for? Could it be that this seemingly random man was more involved in the killings than anyone had previously believed? But when they followed up on this tip, they were confronted with more confusion than clarity. The man, a local businessman, had an impeccable reputation. His alibi was solid. He had been in a meeting at the time of the murder. But there was one thing that stood out to the detectives: his business dealings, his connections to powerful figures in the city, and most notably, his past. He had a criminal history, but not one that would make him a typical suspect. It was the kind of history that raised eyebrows without immediately raising alarms. Did he have something to hide? Was he more than just a bystander in this case? As they probed deeper, they found more questions than answers. There was something unsettling about this businessman, something that didn't sit right, but every lead they followed seemed to lead back to a dead end. And still, the killer remained just out of reach. His calm, calculated demeanor never faltered, and he continued to toy with the investigation. He knew, without a doubt, that the detectives were closing in on him, but he was ready. He had thought of everything. Every possibility, every scenario, every mistake. He had thought of it all, except for one thing. A single, tiny mistake that would unravel everything he had worked for. And when the detectives finally discovered what it was, it would change the course of their investigation forever. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. You see, not all of the detectives trusted each other. There were whispers in the office, doubt, mistrust, and even suspicion among the team. Some believed the businessman was too clean, too perfect to be the one they were after. Others thought that the case had become too complicated to solve. He seemed distracted, off, almost like he was trying to avoid something. One evening, just as Miller and her team were about to head out to follow a new lead, Webb pulled her aside. His face was grim, his eyes avoiding hers. "You need to stop," he said in a low voice, the words so unexpected that for a moment, Miller thought she had misheard him. "Stop digging. This one's too deep, and it's not worth it." Miller's instincts kicked in. She knew Webb, knew him as well as she knew herself. This wasn't like him. He was a man of conviction, the kind of officer who lived for solving cases. So why was he asking her to back off? She didn't know, but something was off and she couldn't ignore it. Not now. But as she started to press him for more answers, Webb grew more defensive. He was sweating. His hands trembled, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. She asked him point-blank if he knew something more, if there was something he was hiding. His response was chillingly vague. There are things you don't know. Things that could ruin everything. Just trust me. Let this one go. Miller stood there, stunned, that they were chasing shadows and dead ends. As cracks began to form within the team, the killer's arrogance grew. He had successfully driven a wedge between the detectives, distracting them from the truth. And as the days wore on, the pressure mounted, with the killer remaining just beyond their grasp, taunting them with each passing moment. Now, the detectives were facing an unexpected crisis. Their best lead was slipping away, the businessman was becoming more elusive, and they were left questioning their every move. Could they really catch him? Or had they been outplayed by a mind far more cunning than their own? The tension was palpable, and as they grappled with their growing uncertainty, a crucial decision loomed. Would they pull the trigger on their final plan, or would they allow the killer to escape once again? The investigation was hitting dead ends at every turn, and just as the detectives thought they were closing in on the truth, an unexpected setback shook them to the core. The piece of evidence they had been relying on, the phone records that seemed to tie the businessman to the scene of the crime, vanished. No warning. No explanation. One moment it was there, sitting in a file on Detective Miller's desk, ready to be the breakthrough they desperately needed. The next it was gone. At first, Miller thought it was a mistake. A mix-up, maybe. But as hours turned into days with no trace of the crucial document, it became clear that this wasn't just an oversight. Someone had deliberately removed it, and the more they searched, the more it became apparent that someone on the inside was sabotaging their efforts. But who? Was it a member of their own team, someone with their own agenda, or was it the killer himself, pulling strings from the shadows? The answer didn't seem clear, and it only made the already complex case even more complicated. The team was torn apart. Some of them were too quick to blame their colleagues, casting doubt on everyone from fellow detectives to clerks at the precinct. Others, however, chose to focus on the one lead they still had left, the businessman, whose alibi was starting to feel less and less airtight. Yet, even as they tracked him down for further questioning, something strange was happening behind the scenes. A figure emerged, someone who had been quietly watching the investigation unfold, someone whose involvement was never anticipated. Detective Webb, usually an asset to the team, started acting out of character. Could Webb be hiding something from her? Could he be compromised, perhaps even working with the killer, as absurd as that seemed? Or was he trying to protect her from something darker, something more sinister than she could comprehend? As Miller walked away from that conversation, a gnawing sense of doubt settled deep in her gut. She couldn't trust Webb, at least not fully. But she also couldn't ignore his warning. What if he was right? What if pushing further into the case would lead them down a path they couldn't come back from? Meanwhile, the case seemed to take on a life of its own. The businessman they were still chasing had become increasingly slippery. No one could track him down, and his alibi seemed to strengthen with each passing day. It was as if he were carefully covering his tracks, erasing every trace of himself from the case. But there was something else happening, something more insidious. The killer, who had once seemed untouchable, now appeared to be playing a game. A dangerous game of misdirection. He was dropping false clues, planting evidence where they least expected it, leading the detectives in circles. And yet, despite his arrogance, there was one thing that seemed out of place, a letter that had been found at one of the crime scenes, a letter that seemed almost too personal, too direct. It wasn't like the killer to leave such a blatant message behind. The detectives analyzed it, but there was no trace of handwriting. The letter was typed, a simple message hidden within a series of cryptic symbols. To anyone else, it might have seemed meaningless. But Miller wasn't anyone else. She saw patterns where others saw chaos. And she knew this wasn't just a message, it was a map. A map that, if deciphered, would lead them to the killer's final, most crucial mistake. But just as they were about to start decoding the letter, something even more unexpected happened. The lead detective, Miller herself, was pulled into a meeting with the higher-ups. They told her that they were suspending her access to the case files, that they were reassessing the investigation due to complications. Miller was furious. She had been so close to solving it all. But now, they were cutting her out. Was it Webb's influence? Had he somehow convinced them to pull her off the case? Or was there something deeper, something that Miller was missing, that had led the brass to doubt her judgment? As she stood there, in that sterile meeting room, her mind raced with possibilities. She had been betrayed. But by whom? And how far did the conspiracy go? She didn't know yet, but she had a sinking feeling in her stomach that whatever the truth was, it was much darker than she could have ever imagined. With her access restricted and the investigation stalled, Miller made a decision. She couldn't let this case go, not when she was so close. The question was no longer about catching the killer. It was about uncovering the secrets buried beneath the surface. Someone was trying to stop her, someone powerful enough to have her pulled from the investigation. But why? What was so dangerous about uncovering the truth? As the pieces slowly began to fall into place, Miller realized that this was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about uncovering a hidden world of corruption, betrayal, and deceit that reached far higher than she could have ever imagined. But would she be able to expose it before it was too late? And as she sat there, contemplating her next move, she realized one undeniable truth. There was no going back now. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. But the truth was waiting, just beyond her reach, and she had to know what it was, no matter the cost. Just as Miller began to piece together her next steps, a new, unexpected twist surfaced, one that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about the case. It came in the form of a phone call, late one evening, when the city was cloaked in a blanket of silence. The caller ID displayed an unrecognized number, one that sent a chill down Miller's spine as she answered. It wasn't a voice she recognized at first, but the message was clear, and it sent shockwaves through her already fragile sense of security. "You've made a dangerous mistake, detective," the voice whispered, barely audible, but sharp enough to pierce the stillness of the night. "They know you're getting too close. You're not the only one looking for answers. You need to stop before it's too late." The line went dead before she could respond, leaving only the static hum of silence. Her first instinct was to call back, to trace the number, but something told her it was pointless. Whoever was on the other end wasn't trying to warn her. They were trying to scare her into submission. The question was, who was behind it, and why had they chosen to reach out now? Her mind raced, scrambling to make sense of the message. She hadn't been alone in this investigation, not entirely. There had been others who had worked with her, trusted colleagues, fellow detectives, and one name surfaced almost immediately in her thoughts: Detective Webb. But Webb had already proven himself unreliable, and his behavior had been unsettling. Was it possible he had made a deal with the people who wanted to stop her from finding the truth? Could he be trying to protect someone, or perhaps someone was protecting him? The more Miller thought about it, the more the doubts began to multiply. The phone call was a warning, no doubt, but it also felt like something more. It felt personal, as if the threat was directed at her specifically. But why her? Why now? She had no clear answers, only questions that led deeper into a tangled web of deceit. Meanwhile, another layer of complication had begun to weave its way into the case, one that had come out of nowhere but was undeniably linked to everything Miller was trying to uncover. A new piece of evidence surfaced, an old surveillance video from a nearby building, one that hadn't been part of the original investigation. It had been recorded just days before the murder, but it was too late to include it in the first round of evidence gathering. The video, when analyzed, showed a familiar face, someone Miller had seen countless times before but had never considered as a suspect: her own partner, Detective Alan Hayes. At first, Miller thought it was a mistake. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Hayes had been there, in the alleyway near the crime scene, but that was impossible. He had an alibi. He was with her during the initial rounds of interviews, part of the team when they had pieced together the early evidence. There was no way he could have been there, yet the video was clear. She watched it again, and again, searching for an explanation. Hayes wasn't in uniform, but he was there, walking toward the building with an unfamiliar figure, someone she couldn't identify. What if Hayes wasn't just a detective on the case? What if he had something more to hide? What if, despite their years of partnership, he had been involved in something far more sinister, something that had now come to light in the worst possible way? The thought gnawed at her. Was he involved with the killer, or was he simply caught up in something much bigger than they had initially imagined? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, some critical piece of the puzzle that was slipping through her fingers. Was Hayes really the man he appeared to be, or was he playing a part in this twisted game from the very beginning? The more she questioned his motives, the more the pieces seemed to fall out of alignment. He was walking with purpose, his head down, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The encounter lasted no more than a few seconds, but it was enough to raise suspicion. As the video replayed in her mind, another unsettling thought crept in. There was something about Hayes' behavior that didn't sit right. He was too calm, too controlled for someone who had been working on a case this volatile. The cracks in his facade were starting to show, but they were subtle. He'd been avoiding eye contact during meetings, and when he did speak, his words lacked the conviction she had always relied on. Had he been lying all along? Or was he simply hiding something far worse? Her mind raced as she processed the implications of everything that had unfolded. If Hayes was hiding something, what did that mean for her? What did it mean for the case? But the more pressing concern was the unknown figure in the video, the person Hayes had been seen with. Was this the key to unlocking the mystery, or was it just another dead end in a case that seemed to be full of them? The problem was, they had no idea who this person was. The video provided nothing but a fleeting glimpse, a shadowy figure that could have been anyone. And yet, Miller couldn't help but feel that this unknown individual held the answers she needed. What connection did they have to the case? What role had they played in the murder? Could they be the one pulling the strings, the mastermind behind the chaos that had consumed her investigation? It was impossible to tell, but the fact that Hayes had been involved with them made it all the more disturbing. But as Miller tried to sort through this new web of suspicion, the phone call, the video, and her growing doubts about her own partner, she received yet another cryptic message. This time, it wasn't a phone call but a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. "You're too close, detective. If you continue, there will be consequences you cannot undo." It was a direct threat, but the words were chillingly calm. There was no rage, no urgency, just a cold, calculated warning. Miller was no longer sure who was behind these messages, but one thing was clear. Someone wanted her off the case. The question was who? And why had they chosen her to be the one to uncover the truth? The stakes had just been raised, and the tension was building to a breaking point. With each new clue, each new twist, Miller was being pulled deeper into a maze of lies, betrayals, and dangerous secrets. And as she looked at the latest thread in her hands, she realized that the closer she got to the truth, the more perilous her path became. But there was no turning back now, not when she was so close to discovering what lay hidden in the darkness. Would she be able to see it through? Or would the killer, or the ones protecting him, finally succeed in silencing her once and for all? You said. The tension had been steadily building, but Miller had no idea just how dangerous things were about to become. It started as a gut feeling, a growing unease in the pit of her stomach, the sense that someone, somewhere, was watching her. At first, it was subtle. The strange car parked across the street from her apartment, the unfamiliar figure standing just a little too long in the same spot, as if they were waiting for something or someone. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the product of too many sleepless nights and too many close calls with the truth. But the unease gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. There was no denying it anymore. She was being followed. It wasn't just the car or the figure standing motionless in the shadows. It was the little things, the way her phone seemed to buzz at the exact moment she passed certain streets, or the way her email inbox seemed to fill with strange, cryptic messages that made no sense but felt like threats. "You're not safe. He's watching." That was one of the first ones, a message that appeared in her inbox without explanation, its sender unknown. She had dismissed it, thought it was some kind of sick prank. But as the messages kept coming, She couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to something far darker, something that was closing in on her from all sides. And it wasn't just digital threats. There were moments when she thought she saw the same man in a crowd, his face obscured, but his eyes never leaving hers. It was as though he knew exactly where she would be before she even did. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just solving a case. She was the case now. One evening, as she left her office after another long day of chasing dead ends, things took a sharp, horrifying turn. She stepped out onto the street, the familiar hum of the city surrounding her, but there was something different in the air tonight. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She quickened her pace, instinctively looking over her shoulder, and that's when she saw him. The figure, the one who had been haunting her every step for the past few days, was standing at the far end of the block, his face obscured by the collar of his jacket, but she could feel his eyes on her. She froze, heart pounding in her chest, fear seizing her like a vice. Her mind raced. What did he want? Why was he following her? She had to get away, but every part of her screamed that it was too late. Miller turned and started walking briskly, trying not to let panic take over. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her run. But when she reached the corner, ready to turn and disappear into the maze of side streets, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Heavy, deliberate, closing the distance between them. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse quickening with every step, but just as she prepared to break into a sprint, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, she knew she was no longer alone. There was something in the air, something dark and oppressive that made her skin crawl. And then, she heard it, whispered words, low and chilling, carried by the wind. "Stop looking, detective. You're in way over your head." The words froze her in place, and she spun around, her eyes scanning the empty street. Miller tried to go about her routine, but it was impossible to focus. Every creak in her apartment, every knock at the door, every phone call made her jump. Her mind couldn't rest, couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was always just a step behind her. And as if things couldn't get worse, a new layer of terror was added to the equation, the sudden disappearance of someone close to her. It wasn't just any person, it was Officer McCall, the rookie who had been working alongside her on the case, the one she had trusted with some of the most sensitive information. McCall had been out on patrol, just doing his job, when he simply vanished. No signs of a struggle, no clues, just an empty squad car abandoned in a quiet alley, his radio still on, static crackling through the air. The disappearance was strange enough on its own, but what made it even more unsettling was the fact that McCall had been one of the few people Miller had confided in about the threats she had been receiving. Could McCall's sudden disappearance be connected to her investigation? Was someone trying to send her a message, warning her to back off? Or had McCall been caught in the crossfire of something far more sinister? The more Miller tried to piece together the puzzle, the more questions arose, and with each new lead, she felt herself slipping further into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Desperation set in as she turned to the people she trusted the most, but with every phone call, every meeting, every conversation, she could feel the walls closing in. Her colleagues were beginning to look at her differently, their glances lingering just a moment too long, their questions a little too pointed. Was she losing their trust? Or was it something worse? Were they starting to suspect her of being involved in something darker than they realized? The fear of not knowing who to trust was consuming her, eating away at her from the inside. As the days went by, the pressure mounted. The threats, the mysterious figure who was always one step ahead of her, McCall's disappearance, it was all building toward something, but Miller couldn't see the end. She was lost in a maze of lies, deceit, and danger, and the worst part was that she had no idea how deep it went. Could she find McCall? Could she stop whoever was pulling the strings before it was too late? Or had she already crossed a line from which there was no return? One thing was certain, the stakes were higher than ever, and she was running out of time. Just when Miller thought she had a grasp on the case, everything shifted in an instant. The clues she had been following, the pieces she'd carefully placed together, suddenly felt like a carefully constructed lie, and she had no idea who had been pulling the strings all along. It all started with a seemingly insignificant detail, something that she had overlooked until now. It was a piece of information she had dismissed as irrelevant, a simple photograph, one she had seen dozens of times in the evidence files. It showed a group of individuals at a charity gala, smiling, laughing, all wearing expensive suits and dresses, their lives looking picture-perfect. But there, in the background, someone stood out. Not because of what they were doing, but because of who they were with. The face in the background, blurred out for privacy in the initial report, was unmistakable. Detective Carlson, the man who had been assigned to assist her with the case from the beginning. At first, Miller couldn't believe it. She had trusted Carlson, relied on him to help her navigate the investigation, and now, there he was, in the background of a photograph tied to the very people she had been investigating. It was too much to ignore. She dug deeper, starting to look through old case files, surveillance footage, and any other possible lead that might explain why he had been there, why he was so deeply connected to the people who had seemingly orchestrated this entire nightmare. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces fell into place, but in a way that left her reeling with disbelief. Carlson had been playing a much bigger role in the story than anyone had realized, and he was not just a bystander or an investigator. He had been part of the conspiracy from the start. Miller's heart pounded as she recalled their last conversation, the one where he had tried to calm her fears, downplay her suspicions, and reassure her that everything was under control. He had been so convincing, so supportive. But now, she realized, it was all an act, carefully crafted to manipulate her into trusting him while he worked against her. She couldn't believe it. The man who had stood by her side, who had helped her sift through the endless piles of evidence, had been lying to her every step of the way.
But why?
Why would Carlson, someone she had always considered a trusted ally, betray her in such a devastating way? The answers didn't come easily, but they started to unfold in the most shocking way. Miller received an anonymous message one evening, just as she was about to leave her office. The message was short, cryptic, and chilling. "Look at the man who helped you the most. He knows everything. He's been hiding in plain sight." Her hands trembled as she read it, and for the first time since she had started this investigation, Miller felt truly cornered. The walls were closing in faster than she could process. Had Carlson been in on the murder from the beginning? Had he been involved in a much darker web of corruption? Was everything she had worked for a lie? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit, but the image it painted was one that made her stomach turn. She tracked down a few more photos from the gala, each one featuring Carlson, but this time, she noticed something else. He wasn't just in the background. In one of the images, he was exchanging a brief, almost imperceptible nod with a man in a suit she had seen before, someone she had dismissed as an insignificant figure. Victor Kane, a business tycoon with a reputation for being involved in shady dealings. Kane had been on her radar as a potential suspect, but she had never connected him to Carlson. Yet there they were, clearly in cahoots. It wasn't just an accidental meeting, this was calculated, orchestrated. Carlson was much more than a cop. He was part of a network that ran far deeper than she could have ever imagined. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about the killer. It wasn't even about the murder anymore. Miller had been investigating the wrong thing. The conspiracy ran so much deeper, and the people she had been trusting, the ones who seemed to have her back, were just pieces in a game she couldn't even begin to understand. Carlson had been playing her the entire time, feeding her information, guiding her down paths that led nowhere, all while working behind the scenes to cover up something far darker, far more dangerous. Her mind was racing as she tried to piece together the truth. The twists and turns were enough to make her head spin. But there was something else, a detail that stood out more than the rest. Carlson had always been so careful, so controlled, but there had been moments, tiny, fleeting moments, when his mask slipped. She thought back to their last conversation in the coffee shop, just days before the anonymous message had arrived. The way he had smiled when she asked him about Victor Kane. It wasn't the smile of a man who had nothing to hide. Miller felt the floor drop out beneath her. She had no idea who to trust anymore. The investigation had spiraled into something unrecognizable, and she was no longer sure who the real enemy was. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that everything she thought she knew was a lie. The real danger wasn't just the killer. It was the people she had trusted, the ones she had worked alongside, who were orchestrating a scheme so complex that it could bring down everything she held dear. And just as the gravity of the situation sank in, a chilling thought struck her. What if the person she trusted the most had been the one orchestrating the whole thing from the very beginning? It was a video, just a few seconds long, and it was enough to stop her heart in its tracks. The video showed her walking down the street outside her apartment, the very same street where she had seen the man following her. But this time, it wasn't just a silhouette. The figure was clearer, and the video zoomed in on the face, Carlson. He had been watching her. All this time, he had been watching her.
But why?
What had he been trying to hide? Was he the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, or was he just another pawn in a much more twisted game? Miller's thoughts were interrupted when she received another message, this time from an unknown number. It was the smile of a man who was in on a secret so big, so dangerous, that revealing it could bring everything crashing down.
You said.
Miller's pulse raced as she sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the final piece of the puzzle. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to see through the facade, but now, she found herself at a crossroads that made every decision feel like a deadly game. The stakes were higher than ever before, and as she stared at the text on her phone, her gut twisted with dread. The message was clear. If you want to keep your life, stop digging. We know where you are. We're watching you. Her eyes flicked over to the photograph she had been obsessing over for days now, the one of Carlson at the gala. He was there, smiling, exchanging glances with Victor Kane, a man she had once thought of as a mere suspect, not the mastermind. Miller could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. The pieces she thought were connected, the pieces that had once made so much sense, now felt like a trap closing in around her. Carlson, someone she had trusted more than anyone else in this case, had turned out to be an integral part of this twisted web. Her mind was in turmoil, the thoughts running in every direction, and she couldn't seem to quiet the chaos that was slowly overtaking her every waking moment. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. Her heart stopped when she saw the caller ID, her partner, Detective Grace Evans. The one person she thought might still be on her side. Grace's voice came through, tight with tension and barely restrained panic. Miller, we need to talk. It's about Carlson. I don't know what's going on, but Miller cut her off before she could say anything more. Grace, you need to tell me everything you know.
Right now.
No more lies. No more games. I've seen the pictures, I know what's been going on, and I need you to be honest with me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Miller felt a strange sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, Grace would be the one person who could shed light on the growing darkness around her. But then, Grace spoke again, her voice shaking with fear. Miller, you have no idea how deep this runs. I've tried to protect you, but you need to stop. You have to let this go.
Please.
For your own safety. Miller's stomach dropped. She could hear the desperation in Grace's voice, the plea to back off, to give up on the investigation that had consumed her every waking moment. But something about it felt off, like Grace was hiding something, like she was trying to warn her without saying the words outright. The weight of Grace's words, combined with the constant threats she had been receiving, was enough to send Miller's mind into overdrive. Are you involved in this, Grace? Miller asked, the question hanging in the air like a sharp blade. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering in her chest. She had never expected to be asking her partner such a thing, but with every new revelation, she realized the truth was slipping further away from her grasp. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Miller held her breath, waiting for Grace to respond, but when she finally did, her voice was a whisper. Miller, you have to trust me. You don't understand. There's more to this than you think. I can't explain it right now, but if you keep going down this path, you're going to get hurt. Worse than you ever imagined. Miller could feel the tension crackling through the phone, the weight of Grace's words hanging heavy between them. It was clear that Grace knew something Miller wasn't privy to, but the fact that she was so scared to say it only made Miller's suspicions grow. Grace's warning wasn't just out of concern for her safety. It felt like a veiled threat, one that sent a chill down Miller's spine. And then, just as quickly as the conversation began, Grace hung up. Miller stood there for a moment, the phone pressed to her ear, the eerie silence filling the space around her. The words from the call echoed in her mind. You're going to get hurt. Worse than you ever imagined. The message couldn't have been more clear. Someone wanted her to stop. Someone was willing to go to extreme lengths to keep her from uncovering the truth. But the question remained, who was it? Was it Carlson, the man who had manipulated her from the very beginning, or was it someone else entirely? And why had Grace, the one person who had always been there for her, suddenly turned on her? Was she involved in this dark conspiracy, or was she just a pawn? 2. Miller's thoughts raced as she weighed her options. She had come too far to back down now. The truth was within her grasp, but the consequences of pursuing it were becoming dangerously clear. She could feel the weight of the ultimatum hanging over her: continue to dig deeper and risk everything, or walk away and hope the darkness would fade. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself to stop, she couldn't shake the feeling that if she walked away now, she would never be able to forgive herself. She had to know the truth. But the truth wasn't the only thing on the line. Her safety, her career, and even her life were at risk. She had no idea who she could trust anymore, no idea who was working with whom. The friends she had made along the way, the partners she had trusted, were they the ones setting her up? Or were they just as trapped as she was? Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from an unknown number. We know what you're doing, Miller. We won't let you expose what's been buried. If you want to live, stop now. The words were chilling, and Miller felt a surge of fear wash over her. She had reached the point of no return, and now, the only thing that mattered was finding the answers, no matter the cost. As Miller walked through the darkened streets, the weight of her decision pressed down on her with every step. She had crossed a line, and now, there was no turning back. The shadows seemed to close in around her, the feeling of being watched never leaving her. And as the night grew darker, she realized one undeniable truth. The deeper she went, the more dangerous the path became. The choices she had to make weren't just about uncovering the truth anymore. They were about survival. And with each new piece of the puzzle, the stakes grew higher. You said. Miller's heart was pounding in her chest as she stood in front of the old, decrepit warehouse, the one place where she knew the final answers would lie. The clues, the cryptic messages, and the web of deceit had all pointed here, but now that she was at the threshold, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread that she couldn't shake off. Every step had led her to this moment, and yet, as she reached for the cold metal door handle, she wondered if she was making a grave mistake. But there was no turning back now. She had already lost too much. Too many people had been destroyed because of this, and she was the only one left who could expose the truth. The air around her was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating as she slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the dim light from a single flickering bulb barely illuminated the room. Shadows crept along the walls like lurking predators, and every creak of the floorboards under her boots felt like it was echoing throughout the entire building. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that the walls themselves were closing in on her, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. The room was barren, except for a few scattered boxes and files on a table in the center. It looked almost too quiet, too still. As she approached the table, a sharp sound, like a footstep, suddenly broke the silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her body. She spun around, eyes wide, but no one was there. The sense of unease that had been creeping up her spine now took root, and she instinctively reached for the gun at her side, the weight of it grounding her in this moment of uncertainty. Miller. The voice echoed from the shadows behind her, smooth, almost taunting. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, as Victor Kane stepped into the dim light, a sly smile spreading across his face. The man who had been at the center of it all, the man she had been hunting for weeks, stood before her, the embodiment of everything she had fought against. But now, seeing him in person, there was something different about him. His confidence, his arrogance, it was as if he believed this moment was his victory. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. "You've come all this way," Kane said, his voice laced with a mocking amusement as he slowly approached. "I'm impressed, really. You've uncovered so much, but you're still so far from the truth. You've been chasing shadows, Miller. You've been looking for answers in the wrong places." Miller's pulse quickened, but she refused to let him see her fear. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with the same fire that had driven her this far. "What have you done, Kane? What is all of this? All the lives you've ruined, it ends here." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about what I've done. This is about what I'm going to do. You see, Miller, the game was never about hiding the truth. It was about creating a new world, one where people like me hold all the power, and people like you are nothing more than pawns in a much bigger plan." Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. The conspiracy, the corruption, it was all part of a larger design. But what was his ultimate goal? What did he really want? Kane's eyes glinted with something she couldn't quite place, and as he stepped closer, she felt an unease settle over her like a heavy weight. "I thought you were smarter than this," Kane continued, his voice lowering as if he were savoring the moment. Grace's name was written in bold letters at the top of the page, followed by a series of chilling admissions. She had been working with Kane the entire time. Everything, every lead, every piece of information that Miller thought had been crucial to uncovering the conspiracy had been part of a carefully constructed lie. Grace had betrayed her. She had fed Miller false information, led her down a path that was designed to keep her occupied while the real plans were set into motion. Miller's head spun as the weight of the betrayal settled in her chest. The one person she had confided in, the one person who had been by her side through it all, had been playing her. Grace had been an integral part of Kane's operation from the very beginning. Her mind raced with questions, but there was no time to process them. No time to mourn the loss of her friend. Kane's smile widened as he watched Miller's reaction. "I told you, Miller. You were never in control. You were just a tool, just like everyone else." He took a step forward, his voice growing colder. "And now you're out of time. There's nothing you can do to stop what's already set in motion. The pieces have all been put in place. You can't escape this." The finality in his words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a brief moment, she felt a wave of hopelessness crash over her. But then, something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to let him win, not like this. Not after everything she had fought for, everything she had lost. She wasn't going to be the victim in this story. She was going to end it. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Miller lunged at Kane, knocking him off balance and sending him stumbling back. Her heart raced as she grabbed the gun from her side, pointing it at him, without hesitation. "You're not going to get away with this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I will stop you." For a brief moment, there was a flicker of fear in Kane's eyes, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable exterior. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He smirked, and Miller knew. He had already planned for this. He had already won. And in that moment, as Miller stood face to face with the man who had masterminded everything, the true horror of the situation became clear. The game was never about winning or losing. It was about the manipulation, the control, the slow erosion of everything Miller had fought for. As the walls closed in on her, she realized she had never been in control, not even from the start. But there was one last twist, one last revelation that would change everything. As the gun in her hand shook with uncertainty, she heard a voice from behind her, one she hadn't expected.
"Grace."
"You don't have to do this, Miller," she said, her voice cracked with regret. "It's not too late to walk away. It was never meant to be this way. You've been a pawn in all of this, but there's still time to make things right." Miller's heart clenched as she turned to face her former partner. Grace's eyes were filled with desperation, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Was Grace offering her a chance to escape, or was this just another lie? Another manipulation? The final choice was hers, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a vice, tightening with every passing second. The truth was out there, but would it be enough to save her, or had the game already been lost? As Miller stood at the precipice of everything she had worked for, she couldn't help but wonder if she had ever been anything more than just another pawn in their twisted game.